I'm Izabella Kaminska. Today I'm joined by seasoned BBC documentarian Jacques Peretti, best known for telling us what the men behind the curtain really have intended for us. His past documentaries include The Men Who Made Us Thin, The Men Who Made Us Fat, and The Super Rich and Us. But now he's out with a new book and an accompanying TV series. It's called Done, The Secret Deals That Are Changing Our World. Jacques, welcome to Alpha Chat.
Hello, Izabella.
Thank you so much for joining us. So I should just explain to our listeners that we ended up kind of collaborating because Jacques, you invited me to participate in the documentary, and so
a fine performance too. Yes, in the film, one of the films in the series, which is about money, the future of money, the death of cash, and you know a lot about that, so it was good.
I don't know about that, but certainly it was really fun to participate, and you're reciprocating by coming along and joining me on the podcast today. The book has been out for a little bit, but the documentary is just showing now. It's kind of a consolidation of all your work thus far, because there's a little bit about the fat industry, there's a lot about the sort of inequality side of things, but what would you say it really hangs on? What differentiates it?
I think there are sort of common themes to all the stories. So in all the journalism that I've done on the BBC and in the new series, there are these kind of genius insights by business people, and I think often unsung, even within the business world, who had these kind of insights into the human behavior. And it's as simple as that, and would have one single genius insight that they would then build a product around or a new idea. And I found that happened time and time again. So I was interested in that common theme and in kind of exploring that. And then beyond that, the kind of implications for where we are now. We're in a kind of moment of huge transformation. I mean, that's always, in a way, that's a kind of cliche, because every period is a transformative period to another period. But we genuinely are going through major changes, technological, in work, in finance, etc., etc. And so I wanted to look at how these genius insights, even from 100 years ago, are still impacting upon business and our lives now.
And I think that's what makes it so interesting. It's that, here at the FT, we tend to write about business and deal making in a really dry, formulaic way sometimes. I mean, we do try to personify these things, but this is a real personification, I would say, of those important deals. And you can get a real idea of the characters in play that I myself wasn't aware of at all. So, I mean, in the opening chapter is all about the death of cash, right? And you talk about the beginnings of PayPal, amongst other things. And I found it very interesting that you link the origins there to sort of MIT research on how we relate to cash itself. I had not really made that connection. I had made it intuitively, but I mean, tell us a little bit about this story.
Yeah, it was fascinating because, I mean, at the very moment that, Peter Thiel and Max Levchin are meeting and they're sort of bringing about PayPal, at MIT, there's this work by a guy called Drzan Prelec into payment systems. Essentially, how do they work and the effect that they have on the brain. And what he discovered with this kind of fantastic experiment that he did with a number of his students, basically put an auction together for a basketball game, and he had half his students pay with cash, half with cards. And what he discovered really stunned him, which was that the people who paid with cash just literally went up to the price of what the ticket would be, but those who paid with cards would bid sometimes 6 times as much as the price on the ticket. What he realised was that he'd kind of identified what he called the flinch moment, which is this moment which we all have when we hand over cash. We actually feel physical pain. There's a moment where we won't let go of the cash. So this is a neurological process. And so by freeing us from cash, bringing in card and contactless payment, we're free to spend without limit. That pain is erased. Now, at that moment, Elon Musk, as he came on board, but Peter Thiel and Max Levchin initially were putting together PayPal, and they'd sort of intuited in a way. They weren't in collaboration with Drzan Prelec, but it was happening at the same time. And I think they arrived at the moment where this whole desire to kind of bring about a kind of opening of the floodgates of payment, into terms of, sorry, I'll start that again. what they did was they brought about the idea of PayPal at the very moment where neuroscience was starting to identify how cash could be eradicated in order to make us spend without limit.
And that sort of opens the door to it being a fantastic business insight, because it's all about maximizing impulse purchases and creating this consumption society that we're now really dependent on, right? But I think, reading the book, I mean, it does seem you present things very neutrally, but there is this sort of, and I would argue with your documentaries as well, of slight sinister. I mean, you present it as if there was a slight sort of sinister side of it. Like the ultimate objective here was to part you from your cash, right?
I think there's drama. I think there is. I think it's interesting because I think that there are, there is nothing as crude as a kind of, puppet master pulling strings. Aha, I'm going to make human beings do this. But what people do is they have a brilliant insight, which then kind of leads to fruition, often in unexpected ways. And, for sure, the work that PayPal did ushered in a new world of money, digital money. What they did was they essentially monetized the internet, by doing a deal with eBay. That became the first major platform, and it transformed the way that people saw a transaction. There was no fixed price. Everything was an auction. It became about the auction of the good, and the fluidity of money that we now have, variable pricing and all these things. They were kind of pioneered by this deal between PayPal and eBay. So these are not things that they could foresee at that moment. They didn't say, 20 years down the line it would be this, but what they did was they had a remarkable insight that led to a whole new world.
But do you think there have been unintended consequences that aren't necessarily for the best? And I mean, you referred to, in the chapter, you referred to the sort of effect on the poor. And ironically, you argue that the poor are much better at sort of repressing those spending urges than the rich. And so here we find ourselves in, say, 2017 in a fintech-obsessed world, where on one hand, we are increasingly seeing new business ventures coming in, wanting to increase frictionless systems. Like the obsession with frictionless is just everywhere. Everything must be frictionless. But on the other side, you're now seeing these other firms who are touting sort of apps that help you manage your, you're spending much better.
It's very complicated. No, it's really interesting because when you talk to the card companies, they say we're frightened by how frictionless we're making it. We need to actually put into place bumps. They call it bumps. So, it's so easy to buy something. You'll swipe, you'll walk through with your coat and it'll pay. They're saying that the responsibility that comes with being a major card company means that they need to put in these bumps to keep what they would say the human element there. So it's think, well, who's telling them to do that? No government is telling them to do that. They're doing it for themselves. And so there's a kind of degree, I think they acknowledge the degree of responsibility they have. And also there's another thing which kind of complicates the moral simplicity of seeing this as evil guys doing something, is that, people themselves embrace these technologies with great gusto. So, the whole idea of ever more seamless ways of paying will be most enthusiastically adopted by consumers themselves. And so there's a kind of interesting thing where something, a hare is let running and then it becomes, they cannot be caught, and I think that's kind of an interesting thing, Well,
it's almost like these business sort of ideas allow us to have, almost too much of what we want, and then we need to find a way to suppress those wants. So we overshoot. I mean, that runs parallel with the whole sugar and fats side of things.
So Hank Cardello was a guy who introduced high fructose corn syrup into Coca-Cola. He was there and I said to him, Hank, how, you sitting opposite me are singularly responsible for obesity. He said, how could I? Honestly, Jacques, at that time, it was a quarter of the price of sugar. Obesity wasn't on the radar. It just seemed a no-brainer to us. And you see, in good faith, they did not realize what they were unleashing with that. It seemed from a business point of view, totally sensible. And so, that's an example of the unintended consequences of a business decision. Nobody set out to make the world fat, but it just happened. as a result of these decisions.
But is that because some of these guys, as you've kind of inferred to me earlier, they are what you would call sort of overzealous entrepreneurs. They're not necessarily intent on, I mean, most of them genuinely want to make the world a better place, but they kind of want to run before they can walk, and perhaps don't evaluate the consequences of their decisions early on in the kind of business line phase.
I think it's putting a lot on them to expect, they aren't politicians, they aren't world leaders. They're, the clue's in the name. They're business people. They're about a business and about making money. And I would hesitate to judge them for something that happens 30 years down the line that they couldn't have anticipated at the time. I just think it's interesting that these ideas had the impact that they did. And I think that that's sort of what I'm trying to explore, rather than creating some kind of crude causality between they did this and therefore it led to that because they intended it. Very, very rarely does anything turn out the way we expect it to.
So you say one of the unintended consequences of, say, PayPal and then Apple Pay being the other big sort of corporate oligopoly that's come into this space is the inadvertent death of cash. And you spoke to Ken Rogoff, who has written a book recently called The Curse of Cash, where he argues that eliminating cash can help us get rid of a lot of vice in the world. Were you sold by that
I think he's
theory?
Stepping back from that position. There's a classic case of a book, The Curse of Cash, and when you talk to Ken, he's like, well, I'm not saying that cash should be got rid of, that it will be got rid of, or it should be got rid of. I think it's interesting. I think he said there's a fascinating paradox at the moment that, that the governments are seeking to bring money under control by reducing the amount of cash that's in the system. But there has never been more cash in circulation. What's going on, says Ken, and this is really fascinating. So I think it's almost, the attitude of, people, the IMF, everyone who basically, the great and good of money is that, this is a hydra, that we chop one head off and it just comes back with 6 more. It's really, cash is there, and it kind of, I think the understanding is that it fulfills a basic human need, as well as an economic need. And that's kind of interesting.
And that's on the tangible side. I mean, obviously there's been innovation, and we've seen things like cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin emerge, but even cryptocurrencies and Bitcoin are fundamentally dependent on that conversion to cash at some point. So if there was a sort of hypothetical ban on cash, I mean, would you think that the business entrepreneurs in the dark markets, wherever, or not necessarily in the dark markets, they would find a way to innovate out, their way around it?
Well, they're not the only ones to. I mean, the stockpiling of cash now is going on with, financial institutions. They've just swapped gold for cash, because they're seeing it as the kind of, as a currency of last resort. What has value? There was I can't remember, there's a South Seas, community who used rocks as the earliest form of currency, and there would be a giant rock and it'd be passed from one, person to the next, and it had no inherent value, but there has something, bottom line, something has to have value in a society, and cash, because it's been around for 2,000 years, seems as good a thing as any.
It's that tangible quality that, again, links back to that flinch effect. So even the banks perhaps need to spend a lot of money on vaulting this physical reality of cash to really understand what the value underpins.
It's an amazing moment, because you'll be at a moment where banks will be wanting to stockpile cash at the very moment where governments are kind of looking at negative interest rates and saying, here's a system whereby basically you can't stockpile cash. You'll have to pay for cash to sit in your vault. You have to lend it.
Right.
And that's the space we're already moving into.
And I
not
guess,
just as a crisis, but just as a kind of economic tool. It's kind of fascinating.
And I guess one of Ken's arguments for banning cash is this capacity to introduce negative rates, amongst other things. But then you have this competing philosophy from the libertarian space, which is about moving away from central control. And if the government comes to give you negative interest rates, we should have private alternatives, private currencies. I mean, I was interested.
It's a kind of very idealist. I mean, control just moved from one institution to another. Instead of it being Barclays Bank, it's Google. Or whatever it might be. It's a kind of slightly naive way of looking at money, I think.
I mean, that's kind of what you're inadvertently suggesting, is that the tech companies are just the new banks.
Well, they want. I think they aren't there at the moment. We're in this transitional period where there's an accommodation between the two, and the Apple Pay launch is a good example of that, because what they did was they worked together. Banks have the bricks and mortar. They have all the structures in place because they've been banks. But the tech companies for sure realize this is the future, controlling money. And so it's a question of, as I say in the book, do the banks might need the tech companies, but will the tech companies ultimately need the banks?
So obviously it's been a small while since you wrote the book. Has there been anything in the cash fintech space that has emerged recently that was, fascinates you, or what would you say where is your focus now when it comes to this?
In terms of I think there's an interesting. There's something quite interesting going on, for instance, in India, when they withdrew the two major notes, the rupee notes, in an attempt to, there was a kind of cold turkey approach to getting rid of cash, which sort of was pretty disastrous, actually. And I think what's kind of interesting is this whole idea of, can we mop up the shadow economy? Because we simply can't collect tax in some crude way. We can't collect tax from the corporations. So can we collect it from the bottom of the pyramid instead of the top of the pyramid? When I interviewed Ken Rogoff, he was quite, he said, well, I don't think that's the major reason. But you see, to me, it seems quite interesting. The idea, the desire to get rid of the shadow economy is in itself quite an interesting notion. Shadow economy has a role to play, and so you sort of think, well, especially when we looked at the financial crash.
Well, I was going to say, because you say about BNP Paribas' role in 2007, depending on. Well, I had not heard of that.
No,
actually.
Have you not? No. Well, this is kind of interesting, and you wonder whether this is a kind of classic. Is this apocryphal, or is it not? But fact is, when you have people at the World Bank saying, we, for one crucial moment when the banks, we have that moment, the Reservoir Dogs moment, where everyone pulls a gun, each bank pulls a gun on each other, and no one will lend to anyone else. The whole system is about to grind to a halt. Where do we get the money from? Where is the liquidity? The liquidity is, basically the shadow economy. Drugs cartels, the money that is floating around. For that small amount of time, that money was indispensable in keeping the legitimate economy running. And so you think, get rid of the shadow economy, at your peril. That's the fear, I think.
I mean, certainly the shadow economy has purchasing power, and it's found ways to I guess, protect that purchasing power through the offshore networks and or through cash holdings, and now potentially through cryptocurrency as well. And I feel there's always a cat and mouse sort of element to it. So we're always trying to clamp down on the shadow economy. They always find new ways to retain or find a way to preserve that value that they've managed to extract out of the economy. So how would you view that in connection to the offshore?
Well, I think that's really fascinating, because I think offshore is, here's an interesting example of something that's perfectly legal, and yet something that a lot of people would consider to be wrong. So it's a kind of, there is an interesting accommodation between the shadow economy and the legitimate economy. So you have a system that operates and is essential for the maintenance of capitalism, for the system to work, and to get rid of the offshore system would be disastrous at one level, but then it would also, but I think also critics of it would see it as essential to creating a legitimate system. So there you have a kind of paradox. Again, you have another paradox. You have something. It's fantastic, because Cayman is an extraordinary place. You go there and no one has jurisdiction over the place. It's independent, and yet it isn't independent. So it literally floats offshore. And I think that's kind of essential for it to maintain its position in terms of the functioning of the system. It's essential. And so that is squaring the circle.
That's really, I mean, again, I think our listeners, and possibly your fans as well, might not expect for you to be so generous about the offshore system.
I think it's just quite simplistic to
just dismiss it as
evil. I think you have to. I'm not really interested in having a moral position on anything. I'm just interested in how things work.
Right.
I don't have a position. What I have is I think you have a sort of duty to try and understand it as well as you can, and then to explain that. And I think that in itself becomes, the reader, the listener, the viewer can then interpret for themselves what that means. But it struck me when you see, I went to a event in Geneva that was basically a number of corporations talking about tax, and I was invited to speak there, and it was kind of fascinating. I said, have you watched my documentaries? And they were like, well, no, that's why we want you to come and speak and tell us about what you think about offshore. And I think they were really disappointed that I kind of turned up and said, I totally understand how offshore works, I can see why there's a reason for it. They said, we were expecting you to be all left-wing and to say it's really awful. And it's kind of, well, of course there are people who think it's awful, but at the same time, if you don't understand how crucial it is to the functioning of international finance, then you don't understand anything. I mean, there's been an extraordinary report by Jan Fichtner, University of Amsterdam, into how Cayman works. Mm-hmm. And he says that Cayman is basically a mechanism for Chinese companies to buy up American business. He said it is the way to do it, essentially. Now, I mean, this is kind of news to even, the people who work on, American newspapers. No one has investigated that. Took an academic at the University of Amsterdam to say, look, this is the key role that offshore has right now. And it's that's fascinating to me.
I mean, again, from my perspective, that's certainly the case. I just like to look at things and try and understand how they work. And I think from that perspective, the offshore is absolutely, you're right, intrinsic to globalization, because corporations need these neutral international zones where they can operate a kind of no man's land for finance, where you can route complex supply chains through, but also with respect to the kind of Cayman being used as a Chinese intermediation point. There's the famous example of Alibaba being listed out of, I think it's Alibaba that's listed out of Cayman. Yeah. But how does that square with transparency and the sort of,
Well, I mean, sorry, I don't mean to be overly cynical, but whenever you hear that word, it's like whenever I hear the word culture, I reach for my gun. Whenever you hear the word transparency, you think that's kind of the last refuge of an argument. I think of course there's no transparency. That's the point. Mm-hmm. The point is that there's no transparency. Of course, on one level, there's transparency if you create a holding company to do a one-off deal, but that's not how it works. It's deliberately obfuscated, and right. That is kind of the point. And I think it's interesting also that when corporations are asked to pay tax, they often, this is what I found at the event that I went to, is that, I'm going to refer to that. So, it's interesting when corporations are asked to pay tax, they sort of say, well, how well is this tax spent? So you've got to a point where they're saying, here's a kind of mechanism that's really a 19th century mechanism for taking money away from companies and then rightfully paying for the state with this finance. But isn't this sort of not really going to work now? What we need to do is find an entire new system. If you because of the complicated nature of international business, what you require is a whole new framework for how to pay for the state. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can't do it through corporation tax. Maybe what you have is you end up having Google running the NHS or cleaning the roads. All these models have been looked at. Used to be, in the Blair's government, it used to be the John Lewis model. And now all of a sudden it's the Google. Every time there's a new model for how we can run the state. But I think it's really fascinating that business, a lot of people, you see, this is the other thing. I think there are a lot of very progressive-minded CEOs of companies like Paul Pullman at Unilever and so on, and they're looking at corporate responsibility in a genuine way. They're not doing it as some kind of thing to stick on a brochure to say, oh, we're doing this. They're actually genuinely concerned about global warming, inequality, and these things. And they're saying, look, we have a role to play. What is our role in the state? What is our role in terms of dealing with these global problems? And I think that's kind of I think what's important is to enter into that dialogue and treat it as genuine rather than as some cynical thing that business is trying to do. I think we're in an interesting moment where the state is having to, redefine what it can afford. And corporations are at an interesting point where they're having to define what their role is in this new world.
That's fascinating in its own right, because it suggests these I would say the tech platforms especially are becoming quasi-state-like in their own endeavors. So when you see these huge cash piles at, say, Google or Apple, and you see them investing in moonshots or say R&D that perhaps the state would have been doing via the military or whatever years and years ago, you're almost kind of transferring the kind of governance role away from the state and over to the Googles, who have this, in some ways, much less accountable executive committee deciding how and where that spare cash should be spent.
They are independent. They're already independent states as companies. And often with the GDP, turnover that's in excess of the GDP of countries that they're operating in. But there's a fundamental disjunction, which is that a nation state operates vertically within the territorial boundaries of the nation state. Of course, there are international agreements. You're tied to organisations, European Community, whatever it might be. But essentially, you are a nation state within those boundaries. A corporation operates horizontally across the planet. Those two don't join. And actually, when you're talking about a globalized economy, it's only corporations who are able to have the kind of thinking that is global, and that is joined up. When I interviewed Thomas Piketty, when I was doing the inequality series, kind of really fascinating. We were talking about tax, and I said, well, what is to be done? To quote Lenin, what is to be done? And he said, I don't know, you could retool the IMF perhaps. And I said, this is like Thunderbirds. You're sort of suggesting that you might as well suggest the wooden puppets fly in and try and take the tax off corporations. Is kind of ludicrous, the idea that governments could do anything. And I think that's why almost corporations are sort of understanding that they have this responsibility, because governments certainly are going to make them do this. So they've got the responsibility themselves, to do something.
But also there's a role, I guess there's an impact from nation states of continuously undercutting each other in terms of corporation tax. So especially on the offshore side, but even here in the UK, we try to make our tax environment as attractive as possible. Ireland does, etc. And there's a point where perhaps, one might argue that the idea of homogenizing, you might as well officially bring down, say, the US tax rate, because that might encourage the money to come back on shore. Yeah. That's a Trumpian policy. Is it mad?
Well, it was initially.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, well, Germany maintained relatively high corporate tax, kept his company. I think it's interesting. I was in Cayman, and one of the top accountants there, he was saying to me, this is really a question of patriotism. Businesses now are being asked to be patriotic, and it's kind of, and that's as strongly as we could put it. It's down to them. So if Siemens or BMW decide to put the money back into Germany because they see a role, they have a role within the state, and that's a patriotic role. And so I think that's kind of the framing of it within the business world, is it wouldn't be put more strongly than that. There is not going to be a sudden volte-face on the place of governments where they're going to start saying, we're going to ramp up tax. We've been in a race to, it's a race to the bottom in terms of corporation tax, because we, for better or worse, decided that this was the way to woo business back. Now, was that a good idea? Was it not? You decide. But, we're at a moment where something else has to be done.
Speaking of which, that's a nice segue into robots, in so much as inequality, distribution of profits. Bill Gates recently suggested that we should be we should tax robots much in the way as we would tax corporations. So you have a chapter about robots, and you have a counterintuitive perspective. Well, you at least present a counterintuitive perspective, which is that maybe it won't be all doom and gloom, and so much as maybe we will create jobs, or robots will be a catalyst towards a better society, not necessarily all this stuff that we're hearing by the doom and gloom parade.
Technology isn't going to be, big metal, machines marching across the countryside taking over jobs. Robotics goes from nano computers cleaning your bloodstream, right through to carers in care homes picking up the elderly, right through to robotic cats looking at, being company for people, right through to machines in factories. And what's interesting is this robot revolution. It's rather like, the cliche of the Industrial Revolution, but in the sense that we have no idea how fundamentally it's going to change our lives. We cannot predict what that's going to be at this moment. But what we can start to predict is we can start to predict economically what might happen to human beings. And so what I talk about in the book is what I call the robot swap. It's a kind of interesting moment where in the last 20 years, as a result of technology and social media and changes in the workplace, we have to some degree roboticized ourselves. So our behavior has become more robotic. We've had to become more efficient. We also, regularly check our Twitter and our Facebook and da-di-da. We have these sort of mechanical rhythms to our life. And this is in a moment where we're humanizing robots. We're trying to see whether robots can beat Jeopardy or whatever it go, and obviously robots are passing the Turing test for the first time. So we're at this amazing moment where we're crossing over. We're becoming more like robots and robots becoming more like human beings. And that's kind of like, not to put a judgment upon it, but it's a kind of interesting moment. And I think, when you look at Brynjolfsson and McAfee, the work that's being done, the third machine age, it's really fascinating. They talk about all human jobs are in 4 boxes. I'm not going to bore you with the details of what they are, but like manual, non-routine, whatever they are. So there's 4 boxes, basically, right from an artist right through to, you're at a checkout and, every type of job. And what they say is that of those 4 boxes, robots will be able to do 3.5 of the 4 boxes, leaving a half a box for human beings. That's a sort of apocalyptic view. The other view is that we won't have full unemployment, we'll have full employment, but there will be a totally new paradigm. At the moment, we expect a minimum wage. We expect some basic things from a job. Saying forget all that. We'll have full employment, but on very, very low wages, with some people paid a huge amount, everyone else paid very, very little. It's kind of what we're doing is we're kind of grasping for what this space might be. And the example that a lot of people are giving as a kind of example of where we might end up with full employment is the car wash paradox, which is that, in the mid-70s, automated car washes came along. They were this bright, gleaming future that would make your Ford Capri, clean. And basically what happened is in the last couple of years, these automated car washes have disappeared and they've been replaced by largely immigrant labour being paid hardly anything. But here's the key thing. Costs less than the automated car wash does because you don't have to look after the thing. They don't have any rights. And secondly, they will work hard because they know that if they don't, they're going to be out of a job. And so the automation has been replaced by human beings.
And in some ways, you see that parallel across the board, whether it's us sort of rejecting espresso machines and moving towards artisanal coffee baristas.
Yes, precisely.
There's this sort of artisanal comeback, which is, I would say, in some ways quite medieval in ways. We want things done by hand, the old-fashioned way, which is economically less efficient technically, but it feels better quality, or as in the case of car washes, it's actually cheaper because of the disparity in wealth, or in income.
I went to a town in the States called Camden, which is the most violent city in America. So has one of the highest crime rates, highest unemployment rates, poverty rates, and it's also got the fastest number of startups in any city in America. It's kind of interesting. So you go there and it's sort of the end of the world and also the beginning of the new world, because what you have is you have tiny businesses being run by young entrepreneurs who went there for a reason, because it was the cheapest place to set up a distillery, a coffee manufacturer, an IT company, whatever it is. So you've kind of got this really fascinating feeling. It's kind of a mixture of depressing and just sort of really uplifting at the same time. You sort of think this could be all our future. That you have manufacturing disappearing, all the factories there are empty and disused, but you have these tiny businesses starting up.
What I'm hearing a little bit is this idea that perhaps some of the mass market globalized innovation can help us afford some of the more inefficient processes such as artisanal work or whatever. So
I don't know. I mean, how likely that is as a solution to mass unemployment is. There's a term that's used a lot in America, which is techno peasantry. That we're going to have a kind of techno peasantry
or a kind of new feudalism.
Yeah, new feudalism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, And then but you see, I think the thing is, we had an aberration, which was 1945 to 1973, or wherever you want to draw the line, 1980, Reagan, Thatcher coming in. Where do we see that kind of period was an aberration in history? The idea of full employment, a welfare state that could be paid for by jobs. We're going back to the pre-war period, and that perhaps is our state of normality. That we had a period that we consider, to be permanent, was very temporary, and that has come to an end. And so what we're doing is going back to that previous period, and that's where the transition is. It's a transition back to an economic normality of precariousness.
But I mean, that ties in, I guess, with, I don't know if you're familiar with Robert Gordon's work, this idea that the low-hanging fruit has been picked in terms of innovation and technology. So all those great innovations that helped us to decrease inequality, they're now by and large gone. And so all new measures are really all about, it's the old Robert Solow quotation that you can see the computer age everywhere but in the productivity statistics. So we're moving the bits of the pie around. We're not necessarily growing it as much as we used to be.
Well, because growth has stopped as a goal, and then what we have is shopping, and that's why, in a way, when there's the discussion about robots and should they be paying tax, that will be funding a universal basic wage, the Elon Musk thing, that we'll all be paid to sit in a field staring at the sun. Well, that's not, shopping is a job, so actually we will have a job, shopping will be a serious job. We'll have to go out and shop because that's what keeps the economy going. So we'll be paid to shop, Izabella.
What do you think of the basic income proposition then? What's your view?
I think robots paying tax is a perfectly sensible notion. If that's going to be the way forward, then that kind of seems to me the logical thing that will happen.
Is there an argument that robots are just, if there's a justification for robots to pay high tax, then corporations should be paying higher tax because de facto it's capital. You're taxing capital, which is the same. There's no differentiation. And yet there's a really strong argument in the business community that says we should have corporation tax at zero. So it seems to be a little bit counterintuitive if then the same business people are saying we should tax robots.
Well, only Bill Gates is saying that, and Bill Gates can say that because Bill Gates sort of believes progressively in the idea of progressive tax for robots, if not for anyone else. It's kind of interesting. I'm sure it wouldn't happen because, as you say, what you'd have is you'd probably have a robotic offshore, wouldn't you? You'd probably have offshore for robots. Where would that be? Guernsey. It's already
and then that's where they start their little rebellion against humans from.
Exactly. But it's fascinating because even the idea, you see, it was really interesting because I was talking to a guy at MIT who said that this kind of divide between human beings and robots is completely the wrong way to look at things. He was saying that most human traits can be turned into code. And he said there's absolutely no reason why a human being shouldn't have a relationship with a robot if he thinks that the robot is going to, or he or she thinks the robot is going to best serve their needs. It was I sort of was mind blown by the idea that there are the people who are the biggest advocates for the robot revolution sort of see human beings, they are on the side of the robots, and they see human beings as the problem. Uh-huh. Because they think that robots could free us ultimately. It's kind of interesting.
But also slightly alarming from a humanitarian point of view.
There's an interlingua, which basically Google discovered they got two robots to translate. They do this basically translation thing where they get a robot to translate one language into another language. And what they found was that the two robots created a language of their own, which was indecipherable to human beings. As a result, they went far beyond what they were required to do. And I said to the guy from IBM, don't you find this a little bit worrying? That they've invented a language within the space of a couple of days that human beings can't decipher because we're not clever enough. And he said, oh no, he said, it's an interlingua, it's perfectly fine. And I said, but they can speak to each other and we
conspire against us.
And they can conspire against us. And he said, yes, but they're not going to take over yet.
Yeah. Nice.
The emphasis on the word yet.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing that I've always thought about with the robots is that fundamentally there is a bit of conflation in the media about what we're really talking about, because people think of robots as the sort of anthropomorphic, humanoid types that will come in and literally be able, generalist type robots, which will be able to do everything that we can do. But really, at the moment, robots are still very specialist. They're a specialist tool. They're a specialist tool that is geared towards one particular task. You're getting more general intelligence, but it's still disembodied. It's not sort of the kind of humanoid robots are still really rubbish. And I've always thought of it from a basic sort of comparative perspective, which is on a cost control front. I don't see how a robot can ever be more competitive than a human, just from the production side, because, we're made of fairly abundant materials. Reproducing us is really quite simple and enjoyable sometimes. Whereas, robots, if they're going to be made out of metals, rare materials, they can never be produced as economically as humans.
Yeah, but you see, I think we're kind of what we're trying to do is we're trying to imagine a future that is unimaginable.
True.
And I think that, if you think that Amazon can deliver a emergency triage to a traffic accident in India in 2 minutes with a drone, whereas it would take 2 hours with an ambulance, then that's where the robot revolution will be. It will be in things that, it will be, one of the interesting themes in the book, I think, that emerged was the idea of this leapfrog, the technological leapfrog that the automated revolution will bring about, which is that societies, and Uber told me this time and time again, I heard this, and I heard this at Uber when I was at their HQ, was they said, the problem with driverless cars is the 20th century infrastructure of the cities, and the fact that we have human beings driving cars. This is what's slowing things down. They were saying was that, in societies where you never had that modern 20th century infrastructure, they can leapfrog Western societies that have what the infrastructure that was once an asset is now a cumbersome problem when it comes to where we're going. So what they're saying is that we're essentially, the developing
we're the ones
society,
getting in the way of the technological process and all our legacy systems.
We are exactly that.
But then I would say, to what end? I mean, so if you can
create a better future for human beings.
But that's only if the robots serve us. Whereas I think some of these things are vanity projects, aren't they? And they have the capacity to overlook the fact that, so you leapfrog and you create this, fully automated environment. But if the perception is it's the humans that are the problem, you have to wedge these humans into the controlled sort of mechanical system that they've created. Then is there not a situation where we're the ones being manipulated by the system to comply with the desires of the system and the mechanical system, rather than have the mechanical system adjust to our sort of crazy, nonsensical, unpredictable ways?
I went to a school in San Diego, which is it's the most advanced form of sort of roboticized teaching in the world. It's called Flex Tech, and basically what they've done is they've done away with teachers. So they have 70 kids in a classroom, and they have one teacher. They're not called a teacher. They oversee 70 kids around laptops. And what they're doing is they all have their own form of bespoke learning. So they're learning whatever they want to learn. And I said to the teacher, how do you feel, standing here? And he said, I feel a bit sometimes like one of those people at the supermarket who you see help somebody with a bunch of bananas when it doesn't scan properly. And I sort of think, it was a really interesting space, because I thought, here are 70 kids and they're looking. There was a girl aged 13 looking at becoming a marine biologist. There was a guy looking at becoming an astronomer. They were looking at whatever they wanted to look at, but they were sort of totally focused. And I thought, well, it's sort of horrific and brilliant at the same time. And that's kind of what our future is going to be. It's not going to be any one thing. It's going to be both at the same time. And I think that's kind of where we're going to be.
So unfortunately, we didn't have time to delve into one of the other chapters I wanted to discuss, which is the post-truth environment. But what you just said there reminded me of this, arguably this problem of the echo chamber, which is if you're not necessarily exposed to the opinions of others who are completely unrelated to yourself. And you said, like, your hypothetical student, they can completely sort of educate themselves these days. But perhaps the problem is that actually education is a part of being exposed to other things, not just being in a tunnel. Nevertheless, there is a big chapter on the news issue as journalists. And just very quickly, what would you say is the takeaway of that chapter?
That there were no facts to begin with. You know, George Orwell in the Spanish Civil War was saying that he read about battles that never happened, and that he also witnessed battles that were never reported upon. And I think what's fascinating, well, what I tried to do was to put this post-truth debate into a historical context, to look at how news became sensationalized, why people stopped believing in the truth. And again, rather like there was the aberration of a period of full employment and so on between 1945 and 1973, so there was a kind of period where we believed in journalism, we believed in truth. Post-Watergate, we had, you know, the shining armour, you know, Woodward and Bernstein, the idea that there was some objectivity. You know, before that, rather as now, we had players, we had press barons who wanted to control and manipulate politics. And so we've gone back to that state. And that's kind of where we're at now.
And that's, I think, a nice theme to finish it on, which is this idea that effectively the last, say, 60, 70 years were the aberration. And we're in a painful situation now because we have become so used to that aberration, we think it's the norm, but perhaps it isn't. Perhaps actually social forces are moving us back to where we came from before. Is that a fair sort of assessment?
The great curse that we have is the great curse in one word that we have as a result of that aberration is expectation. We have an expectation of employment, of an education, of stability, and that, you know, is a chimera, you know.
So perhaps it was never sustainable in the long run. It was always going to be.
It was a blip.
Yeah.
It was a historical blip. Ken Rogoff has a fantastic thing on his wall, which is a chart of. You look, absolutely. It's a chart of all the depressions over the last 400 years.
Well, that's because of this time is different. But presumably,
yeah, exactly. But it's fantastic, and you sort of look at 2007, 2008, and it's kind of relatively minor, you know, as is 1929, weirdly. And you sort of think, well, there you go. This is history. And so, and this blip that we've gone through in the last 40 years is kind of coming to an end. And I suppose that's kind of that's one of the things that the book's about, yeah.
Right. So whether that ends up being a good thing or a bad thing, we will have to wait and see. It's hard to predict the future. But on that note, thank you so much for coming to talk to me. And certainly that's just, you know, the starting point. Do go and read the book and watch the documentaries that are coming out. So thank you very much.
Nice.